Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 31st week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, in the mainstream media, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you also find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. 3 weeks ago, Noam Chomsky wrote as follows. At 3 a.m. Gaza time, July 9th, in the midst of Israel's latest exercise in savagery, I received a phone call from a young Palestinian journalist in Gaza. In the background, I could hear his infant child wailing amidst the sounds of explosions and jet planes, targeting any civilian who moves and homes as well. He just saw a friend of his in a car clearly marked press blown away. And he heard shrieks next door after an explosion, but can't go outside or he'll be a likely target. This is a quiet neighborhood, no military targets, except Palestinians who are fair game for Israel's high-tech, U.S.-supplied military machine. He said 70% of the ambulances have been destroyed, and that by then over 70 had been killed, and of the 300 or so wounded, about two-thirds were women and children. The number now is close to 1,500 dead in Israel's murderous assault on Gaza. Few Hamas activists have been hit, or rocket launching sites, just the usual victims. It's important to understand what life is like in Gaza when Israel's behavior is restrained, in between the regular manufactured crises like this one. A good sense is given in a report to UNRWA by Mads Gilbert, the courageous and expert Norwegian physician who's worked extensively in Gaza, also throughout the vicious and murderous Cast-Lead operation. In every respect, the situation is disastrous. Just keeping to children, Gilbert reports, Palestinian children in Gaza are suffering immensely. A large proportion are affected by the man-made malnourishment regime caused by the Israeli-imposed blockage. Prevalence of anemia in children under 2 years in Gaza is at 73%, while prevalence of wasting, stunting, and underweight have been documented at 34, 31, and 32% respectively. Close quote. And it gets worse as the report proceeds. When Israel is on good behavior, more than 2 Palestinian children are killed every week, a pattern that goes back over 14 years. The underlying cause is the criminal occupation and the programs to reduce Palestinian life to bare survival in Gaza, while Palestinians are restricted to unviable cantons in the West Bank, and Israel takes over what it wants, all in gross violation of international law and explicit Security Council resolutions, not to speak of minimal decency. And it will continue as long as it is supported by Washington and tolerated by Europe, to our everlasting shame. Close quote. That's from Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program. Today is August 1st. The ceasefire in Israel's U.S.-backed attack on the 1.8 million people of Gaza which was supposed to begin this morning, broke down almost immediately. Discussions between the Army of Occupation and the resistance government were supposed to begin in Cairo this evening. But both the Egyptian government and, far more importantly, the U.S. government support the attack that has now killed more than 1,400 people, more than Israel killed in its last major attack on Gaza in 2008 and 9, between the election and inauguration of Barack Obama. Obama refused to condemn that massacre as well. So you're watching news from Neptune, a hand-washing edition, as the President of the United States once again commits mass murder. We'll start with David Johnson on the other major foreign policy crisis that the U.S. government is the primary operator in, the situation in Ukraine. David?
Okay, yes, a little background. Last week I spoke a little about things that have been going on in Ukraine, a little background to where we are at present. And between last week and now, a couple interesting things have happened. First of all, I guess the Ukrainian ruling coalition government collapsed because of withdrawal by two political parties, the Fascist Freedom Party and the right-wing UDAR Party withdrew from the government. What's interesting, though, is before this happened, that many of the parties of the that were in opposition to this formed government. This is a parliamentary system, remember. The Communist Party and a couple other minor parties were actually attacked and beaten on the floor of the Ukrainian parliament as well as outside the Ukrainian parliament, forcing them to, basically preventing them from going to the parliament and representing the people who elected them. Well, now it's there's been a complete ban on both the Communist Party of the Ukraine and the other minor parties that were in the opposition coalition. I mean, and this is a government that not only is supported by U.S. tax dollars, your tax dollars and mine, but that was also, this government was, basically brought to power in a violent coup as a result of our tax dollars. And, it's just interesting to see what the priorities are of those, that 1% who actually rules our government. The average American would not support this if they knew entirely what was going on. Another interesting thing that happened in the last week in the Ukraine was that Ukraine's parliament, before it dissolved, I guess, rejected a deal that was going to allow U.S. and companies to buy a large percentage, 49% of the Ukrainian natural gas company. Evidently, that deal fell apart, and they've also rejected previously agreed to austerity measures through the IMF and stuff. So this is really interesting what's happening. It seems like, the elites in Washington, D.C. and their counterparts in the EU, all of a sudden they're basically molded little puppet government, which has, of course, as I mentioned earlier, included outright fascists involved in the government, not just in the parliament, but actually in ministries in the government, is starting to sort of fall apart a little bit, which is interesting. I guess it goes even with the most money, including, I believe it was Assistant Secretary State Victoria Nuland was saying that they spent, this was like a year ago, $5 billion of our tax money to undermine a democratically elected government that brought the current government of the Ukraine into power. Just more and more the same. This what brought this government to power is similar to what was happening in Venezuela here earlier, or actually last year. They attempted to do it with the normal means of street demonstrations and riots and hoarding of goods and other economic as well as actual outright violent political means. It failed in Venezuela. But a few years ago, back I believe it was about 5 years ago, the democratically elected government of Honduras was overthrown in a military coup. And right from the start, Washington said they had nothing to do with it. Well, with the help of WikiLeaks, we found out about a year or two later that that was a total lie again, that our government has been telling us. And likewise with what's going on in Ukraine. And that's sort of why I'm focusing here, because you're not going to get the whole story or even the real truth, any portion of the truth from the U.S. corporate media. I mean, they've been wrong and have lied continuously, time and time and time again. What happened to those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And I could go on. I mean, the list is endless. And the point is that the American people, this is a foreign policy the majority of the American people do not support. Just to let you know some recent things that have happened in Ukraine, I guess the Red Cross has described the situation in the eastern Ukraine, which is trying to form its own independent countries. Is basically being bombarded by the Ukrainian military. But anyway, the Red Cross has said it's a humanitarian catastrophe and has ordered rapid evacuation of children from the war zone, and that basically they're advocating that they're applying to the UN in order to get a safe corridor of some way, basically from those eastern provinces into Russia to basically evacuate refugees out of there as quickly as possible. And plus, there's a lot of people that are injured that can't get necessary medical care. So, more problems. And what's interesting too is the latest, or actually as of a couple of weeks ago, the latest propaganda barrage that's been coming out of Washington and the U.S. corporate media has been proven again a lie. Satellite images that Kiev produced as so-called proof that the Malaysian airliner was shot down by the resistant forces in the eastern Ukraine didn't deploy. Basically, supposedly the satellite images Kiev produced as proof it did not, that the Kiev government didn't deploy anti-aircraft batteries around the MH17 Malaysian crash site, carry altered timestamps and are from days after the actual MH17 crash. The images which Kiev claims were taken by its satellites at the same times as those taken by Russian satellites are neither Ukrainian nor authentic. The Defense Ministry said the images were apparently made by an American keyhole reconnaissance satellite because the two Ukrainian satellites currently in orbit, SIC-1 and SIC-2, were not positioned over the part of Ukraine's Donetsk region shown in the pictures. This goes on to say that at least one of the images published by Ukraine shows signs of being altered by an image editor. So again, more lies. It appears that it takes just a little time before we know the truth. But again, another foreign policy disaster financed by our tax monies, which could be desperately used here in the United States for the American people.
It's not a pretty story. Comments, Karen?
No, I think David summed it up pretty well. The only thing I want to mention is that regarding the I just yesterday it dawned on me. I remembered a couple months ago on the AWARE program, I think two of us were mentioning something about Blackwater and
yes.
scenes of them being in the Ukraine at one point.
They've changed their name, I guess, to Greystone now.
Well, yeah.
This is like what, the
Changing their name.
third or fourth name change?
Right.
In fact, it was Academy. And the article, I just had it in my head, Blackwater Aka Academy. And you're right. Then they became something else, and now they're Greystone?
Greystone,
Okay,
yes.
Greystone.
Sounds so pleasant,
So
doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'll have to dig out that article and come up with it, but I think over time we forgot about that, and I think that's significant. If they were actually there in the Ukraine, we know we have evidence of the tape from the taping that Victoria Nuland made, but I think that article I'll have to bring it next time.
For the viewers who are unaware, Blackwater is an infamous mercenary company, well, until recently was based in the United States. They used to have a huge training facility. I think they still have the training facility in North Carolina. And it's comprised mostly of ex-Special Forces, U.S. Special Forces and Navy SEALs. The owner of it is Eric Prince, an extremely right-wing Christian fundamentalist. And they received notoriety basically because of their actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but mainly in Iraq when the occupation there. Basically murdered people and got away with it. And we also know about what happened after Hurricane Katrina when they were deployed to New Orleans. In fact, there's a local Urbana resident who was actually in New Orleans and had a Blackwater thug point an M16 in her face and told her to get out of the street after she questioned their authority to order people to get out of the street. So yes, I mean basically, and again, it's a private mercenary company, and that's being financed by our tax dollars. So again, I mean, who's running the show here? I mean, yeah, we know who's running the show, but it's not the American people.
Right. Oh, and they're located now in Dubai. They've been there for a couple of years to avoid prosecution by the U.S. and probably to avoid maybe paying taxes, whatever. But
I'm sure that too. Yes.
Either way, this Yeah, no, it's pretty bad.
And that's just one of the companies that have spun off from the so-called Special Operations Command, where most of these things began. And it points up the extent to which the U.S. government in the Obama administration, as in earlier administrations, but particularly in the current administration, is using mercenaries to carry out its nefarious activities around the world. The Special Operations Command itself claims to be active in 124 countries around the world. And be clear on what their activities are. Rendition, we call it, but that's kidnapping, torture, murder. The European Union has just rather shamefacedly admitted that Poland really did violate the conditions of the Union by hiding a CIA torture site in Poland. And these groups are all part of the American underground war-making system. One of the things the Obama administration has done to avoid the sort of opprobrium that the Bush administration gathered because of its wars around the world is to put its wars underground, or in another sense, in the air, where they're hidden. Obama's drones are supposed to be a form of international killing that doesn't risk American casualties and doesn't risk publicity. The drones kill, and the only reason anyone knows anything about it is because some of the surviving targets are able to talk about it. Most Americans don't know that Obama has killed perhaps 5,000 people with the drone strikes, hundreds of them children, and that the Special Operations Command are active in most of the world's countries, notably in Africa, but also in Asia and even in Europe, to say nothing of South America. And the use of mercenaries in connections with the Special Operations Command is facilitated by the fact that they're often the same people. People who have been in the Special Operations Command slide over into something like Eric Prince's operation and are doing the same thing in Iraq, say, that they did when they were members of the U.S. military. The occupation of Afghanistan by the Obama administration, which the Obama administration constantly says is ending, is of course not ending because the Special Operations Command is there along with the mercenaries. So one of the effects of the Obama administration is to drive the murderous American war fighting around the world underground. And it's because the Obama administration is afraid of one of the few enemies that it actually does fear, that is the American public. The important thing is the American public doesn't know about this, and therefore the Obama administration's reputation as a group of progressives is safe. And now the Ukraine example, or the Ukraine situation that David was describing, seems to me to be a particularly fraught example of the collaboration of the American media with the administration's attempt to hide its wars. The Obama administration is following an absolutely terrifying policy of promoting conflict with Putin's Russia. And all we get through the mainstream media is this notion that the evil Mr. Putin is invading Ukraine. This is crazy stuff. Yeah. But since it's not being discussed openly in the American media, it's difficult to counter. And most Americans walking around all simply hear that, of course, that madman Putin is promoting war. And so my grandson calls me this week and says, are we going to have a third world war because of what the Russians are doing? He's a perfectly good consumer of the American news. And this is a desperate situation that that's important for us to counter in whatever ways we can. Noam Chomsky has pointed out that, and I quote, the general public are not even aware of major decisions that will determine their fate, hence are in no position to influence them, close quote. And that, of course, is exactly what the Obama administration wants, the public being in no position to influence these decisions. The truth be told, 3/4 of Americans disapprove of the wars the Obama administration is carrying on and would disapprove, if they knew of it, of the belligerent stance the U.S. is taking towards Russia in regard to Ukraine. But in the meantime, Americans' war policy is continued by the administration and backed to the hilt by the Congress. There have been now 2 votes on congressional resolutions about the vicious Israeli attack on Gaza. The resolutions were unanimous in both the House of Representatives and the Senate in approving Israel's crimes. This is quite remarkable. Even I'm surprised by that. You're watching News from Neptune, where our task is to talk about the things that mainstream media isn't talking about. Karen, you have anything particular you want to put on the agenda today?
Well, I think that as of after the Vietnam War, there were a lot of things that I've said this before from reading Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes. They made it clear that the U.S. population would not approve of war. So therefore, or for going to war again, so therefore we had to use proxies. And that's why, particularly through the 80s under Ronald Reagan, but it did begin with Carter administration. But under Ronald Reagan, I mean, the things that we did in El Salvador, that we're responsible for, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in, what's the other nation? I forgot, Honduras. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But usually what we did was we would use their militaries, train their militaries at our school here in Fort Benning, Georgia, I believe it is, known as the School of the Americas, in torture tactics. Our CIA was very good at that, and this is all documented, and let them do the dirty work, just as in Indonesia back in 1965. Their military did all the dirty work, killing almost 1 million people, but our CIA was there, and they had a list of people that they definitely wanted killed because they were communist, and they passed that to the Indonesian military to do the dirty work. A lot of Chinese were killed. A lot of Chinese Indonesians were killed as a result. A lot of innocent people were killed. I mean, they were all innocent, but it's just the idea that the U.S. was behind this, and it just goes on and on and on. So I think that what Obama is doing now isn't necessarily unique to our government. I think the difference is that they use drones, and they tell us on the media all these things. They give excuses and they give arguments. Where I think under the Reagan administration, I don't know, I wasn't in this country, but I don't think they ever mentioned it. I think they kept it all quiet. Just as in Indonesia, I don't think most of us, Noam Chomsky talked about it a lot, but I don't think the average American heard anything about what was happening off our shores. So I think what's happening now, more people know about what's happening because we're following it because of the internet. But still, the average American who is not getting their news from the internet, or they're not getting the correct news from the internet, have no clue.
There is a parallel. I think you're right in pointing that out. When the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, most people don't remember this. It's those of us who were actually there perhaps do, but even many of folks like us don't. When the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, they had a conscious program to imitate the Kennedy administration, which had come into office 20 years before. Now, in the normal mythology of American politics, Reagan is on the right and Kennedy is on the left. It's nonsense, of course. But the idea is that, there couldn't have been any such thought. But look, the people who are running the government in Washington, in the Reagan administration and in all the others, aren't idiots. We sometimes talk as if they are, but what they do is vicious, not stupid.
Yeah.
And what the Reagan people decided they needed to do coming into office in the first years of the decade of the 80s was to do what John Kennedy did in the first years of the decade of the 60s. Kennedy's mantra has been, oh, we've got to get this country moving again. Well, in fact, the policies he followed were essentially those of the Eisenhower administration, but there needed to be sort of product differentiation. You have to say, we're doing something different. Coke is not like Pepsi, and therefore, it's going to be different. Well, the Reagan administration adopted that same pattern in 1981 and followed the foreign policy and indeed domestic policy of the outgoing Carter administration. But one of the things that they particularly wanted to do in their imitation of Kennedy was to put troops into Latin America the way Kennedy had put troops into Southeast Asia. And the amazing thing to the Reaganites of the 1980s was the discovery that they couldn't do it. They didn't have the freedom of action in imperial murder that the Kennedy intellectuals had in the early 60s. Why? Because the outrage in the United States over the developing Vietnam War led finally to what came to be called in American politics the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome was the settled conviction on the part of many Americans that we really shouldn't send our troops abroad to kill people in peasant societies for the profits of the 1%. That seemed like a bad idea. And the Reagan administration discovered, to their dismay, that the Vietnam Syndrome was strong enough that they could not do in Latin America what Kennedy had done in Southeast Asia because of the opposition of the public. So what did they do? They put their policy underground. They hid it from the American people. The Contra War in Nicaragua was done on the QT. The whole idea of killing people, they killed just as many people as an earlier administration would in the same period of time, killing people, but now they couldn't talk about it. Now they couldn't do it openly. Now they couldn't do it publicly. They had to do it underground. And in a sense, another generation on, that's what the Obama administration has done in its wars in Southwest Asia. And so what we're dealing with right now is a situation in which the American people disapprove of the wars the Obama administration is carrying on. And because of that disapproval, the Obama administration has to simply lie about what it's doing. It is lying, for example, when it says it's trying to work out a ceasefire in Gaza. The notion that poor John Kerry is working so hard, running around the world, trying to get the ceasefire going, and these locals are just so nasty and the terrorists are so dangerous that he can't get it done. This is nonsense. This is great nonsense. It's propaganda nonsense because it leaves the U.S. in the position of trying to say, we're honest brokers looking for peace among these terrible warring parties in the Middle East, when in fact what the U.S. is doing is supporting its stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, that is Israel, in its own, in America's own long-term imperial designs in the Middle East, designs that profit the 1%, not the Americans, and certainly not the locals. Now, until we understand the extent to which the administration is lying to us, the extent to which John Kerry's search for peace is a charade, then we're not going to get very far in understanding what actually is going on in the world, and more importantly, what the government that we are in some sense responsible for is actually doing. I'm reminded of another remark of Noam Chomsky's. That's the reason we don't study history. It just teaches us too much. Well, looking at the history of the Reagan administration and even the Kennedy administration teaches us something about the Obama administration. Yeah. You're watching News from Neptune, and there are enough things on our agenda to keep us busy for a long time. Comments?
Well, yeah, Carl, I mean, if Kerry really wanted to stop the war, all we have to do is say, okay, we're cutting off your supply of weapons.
Exactly.
Instead, we send them more.
Exactly.
And I think it just came out this week. We just delivered more weapons to Israel.
You're absolutely right.
I mean, that's...
All the weapons that Israel has expended in killing people in Gaza, the U.S. said, oh, hey, here's some more.
Yeah.
While Kerry is running around the world saying, gee, I'm having a terrible time putting a ceasefire together.
Now, I did find out recently that other nations are delivering weapons also to Israel. We're not the only one, but we're the number one. I have some Finnish people on Facebook that were complaining about Finland's like the third or the fourth supplier of weapons.
That's an important point.
Yes.
But is that private sector weapons or actually through the government? I think that's
I'm
important.
not, that's a good point. I'll find out.
Okay,
I
because
honestly
it's
don't
one
know.
thing for Israel, the Israeli government, to buy weapons from private arms manufacturers. It's
Yeah.
another, like in the case of U.S. tax dollars, where over minimum $3 billion a year
see.
goes to Israel in the form of military and economic aid.
Okay, let me look into that.
Okay.
I do know that I saw a documentary, or I saw, Democracy Now! Amy Goodman a couple weeks ago did interviews in Sweden, and of course they have a conservative government in place right now, and they were complaining that they're now, I think it's through Saab, it's one of their that we think of as an automaker, that they're doing weapons, and they're delivering weapons. And I'm not sure where else, but that's a major industry
How
now.
far Sweden has
Yes,
degenerated
yes.
from just a few decades ago.
Yes,
Look
exactly.
Look at the participation of NATO countries. Remember,
Right.
that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that's supposed to defend Europe against the vicious descent of Asian conquerors sweeping into Europe and speaking Russian in Paris or something. NATO, which in fact has become America's way of confiscating the military of the West European states and using it for its own imperial purposes, notably in Afghanistan most recently. NATO has been the way in which countries, even including the European powerhouse Germany, have been forced to play along with with American war making. The president of Germany, a couple of years ago, the German president, the parliamentary systems of most of the European countries have figurehead presidents who take the place of a monarch, and preside over as head of state instead of head of government. Angela Merkel has been head of government in Germany for a while, but the head of state has changed several times. Mostly people, Americans, don't know. One of the reasons one of the heads of state, one of the presidents, departed was that he said publicly, well, yes, we've got to send troops to fight in Afghanistan because if we don't, the Americans will be nasty to us economically. The real reason for our killing people in Afghanistan is to be appropriate attack dogs for the Americans. The problem is that had as Kenny Kissinger would say, that had the extra added advantage of being true, but the fact of the matter is you're not supposed to express truths like that in European politics, and they literally turfed the guy out of the presidency. They forced him to resign from the presidency for saying this.
Wow.
I don't even remember his name. Do you remember his name, David?
No, I don't.
Well, he was that forgettable. I mean, the problem is that he just once opened his mouth and said something true, and he was told, you don't work here anymore. That's not unusual. That's the sort of subservience that U.S. has demanded from NATO and has almost always gotten. He was a rare exception.
Yes, he also said, Carl, he went on to say that basically the reason for the NATO troops at the bequest of the U.S. Government being in Afghanistan was to control basically access to natural resources. In other words, Afghanistan sometimes in the past has been called Pipelineistan.
Right.
And also saying so that they could impose their economic system upon other countries, and that Afghanistan was just one of those countries. So, I mean, he went even farther than that. But, what's interesting is the European people in general, especially the German people, are opposed to having German troops in Afghanistan. Because up until just a few years ago, it was a violation of the German Constitution, which was established after the new German government that was established after World War II in 1948, I believe. It was a provision in their Constitution that no German troop would be deployed off of German soil. And somehow the Christian Democratic government, the ruling government in Germany a few years ago, with the help of a good number of the so-called opposition, the SPD, the Socialist Democratic Party, were able to change that in their constitution to allow to have German troops actually stationed off of German soil for military purposes.
And now we see a parallel thing going on in Japan, right?
Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
I was just going to say yes, and now we're rearming Japan, or we've rearmed them literally broken their constitution.
And you know, the problem is that, you know, when people are opposed to foreign policy, I mean, foreign policy to most people that are out there struggling every day, every
Right.
week, just trying to be able to, you know, keep a roof over their head and try to get a little bit of head. It just seems like it's even when they know what's going on, there's just a feeling of helplessness. What can they do about it? You know, what is it we can do to change this? I hate it. It stinks that money that's being used to basically enrich the 1% and to kill people, innocent people, most of them. It could be used for so many purposes here, such needed purposes we need to have done here in the United States, like a national health care system, like high-speed rail,
Right.
like alternative energy, and on and on and on. Strengthen Social Security so no one has to be destitute in their old age. Free college tuition. You know,
Right.
our young
Right.
people here in the United States, I mean, they're very unique in the world. Well, I should say in the developed world, is they actually have to go into massive debt to finance a college education.
Right, right.
Europe, it's free.
Yeah.
It's free. And in fact, until a few years ago, students actually received a stipend every month if they were students at a university or, you know, the equivalent of a junior college. So, I mean, you know, it's a matter of priorities. You know, they keep saying we don't have any money, that we have budget crisis. Well, we don't have budget crisis, and we have revenue crisis. It's so amazing how fast the U.S. Congress can cough up money for more wars, you know, or to give the billionaires another tax break. But I want to go to something, Carl, you know, mentioning the 1980s, the Reagan administration and their
Right.
murderous activities in Central America. It's real interesting because, you know, the little buzzwords have changed. You know, now the word is terrorist. You know, anybody
Right.
that opposes the 1%, you know, is a terrorist, you know, and as opposed to using a strict definition of what a real terrorist is, basically killing unarmed civilians. The thing is, back in the 80s, the buzzword was communist. Well, what was a communist back then? I mean, I talked to a priest who lived in Bolivia for 20 years. This was about 10 years ago. And he lived in Bolivia in the 1970s and 80s, and he had to leave the country. He had 24 hours to leave the country, and he was called a communist by the local military commander. Why? Because he helped start a peasant banking cooperative. Where basically small peasant farmers could borrow money at 1 or 2% interest, and it was run as a cooperative basis. Well, it turned out the local military commander's wife was a local loan shark, charging 18 to 25% interest. So when the priest protested his being called a communist to the military commander, he said, the priest said, "I'm just for the common man." The commander's response was, "If you are for the common man, you are a communist." Hence the definition.
Yeah.
I once met the almost legendary Brazilian bishop, Dom Helder Carrera, from the northeast, poor section of Brazil, more than a generation ago, back in exactly the time you were talking about, David. And Helder Carrera, a charming man, was famous for saying, "When I fed the hungry, they called me a saint. When I asked why they were hungry, they called me a communist." And our mentor, Noam Chomsky, points out that the war that the Reagan administration and following conducted in Latin America in general was primarily a war against the church, precisely because the church was represented by people like Dom Helder, who under what was then called, in those days, liberation theology, asked questions about why the people were hungry, and in the particular case you raised, why it was the military that was profiting from the distress of the people. This is a legacy of American policy, and not an aberration. This is American policy, and the American policy, mutatis mutandis, adding terrorists for communists, remains consistent from the administrations of a generation and two ago to today. That's what we're dealing with. You're watching. Oh, I also wanted to mention another thing. You mentioned in passing, David, the education issue. The peculiar differences between the support for education in Europe and in the U.S., not an accident. It's a quite conscious policy in the United States to deal with that uprising of popular sentiment that began on college campuses in the 1960s in regard to American foreign policy. You had to live through it to know how much the American establishment was taken by surprise by that. Yeah. I mean, in American universities in the 60s, one looked around and saw that there were other places, those mad people in Latin America, for example, where students were involved in politics, but of course that didn't happen here. Our students were going to class and they weren't interested in what the government was doing. Well, that changed, in part because of the draft, but not by any means wholly because of the draft. Oh, believe me, I was there. And that changed, and it changed to the tremendous surprise of the American government and the 1% who supported them. The late Alex Coburn used to say you can take the American ruling class by surprise about once every 10 years. I think as in this as in other things, Alex was optimistic, but they were taken by surprise in the 1960s. And the arrangement of American higher education since then has been primarily to see that that doesn't happen again. And one of the major methods is the debt trap. Students right. who know they have to keep their nose clean to get their degree in order to get enough money to pay their student loans are not going to be making any waves. Students who come out of college with immense student loans are also docile. And that docility is exactly what's been encouraged by the neoliberal revolution of the last 40 years. It works.
Okay, question on that too. What about professors? One of the things I've been reading that Noam Chomsky has been saying is that, well, research at one time during that period of time, the 60s, was financed primarily by government, the public. And he said as a result, there was a little greater transparency, or maybe that's not the right word, not transparency, but overview. And he said as a result, we were more outspoken. But today, it's all private. It's all been privatized. And as a result, we know where funding, universities know where the funding is coming from. There's so much funding coming from corporations. So it hampers any kind of activism, I think, on the part of the professors as well. Plus the fact that now they're hiring so many adjuncts, they're not providing tenure. That's really about control. I don't think there's any question.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so it's the whole thing, and it's got to have been a plan. There's no way any of this came about without planning in advance.
Well, you ask the fundamental question with which any historian wants to begin his exercise: cui bono? Who profits? Whose interest in being assured? Now, that's not a sure guide because incidental things may occur. Other people may profit from the crimes or even from occasionally the good actions of others, but it's a place to begin. So who profits from this sort of situation? Who profits from an American foreign policy that turns out to be so different from what we say it is? Most Americans, if we stop most of our fellow citizens on the street, most of Americans would say, well, of course, the U.S. is working for democracy and peace around the world. That's what we've always done, haven't we? Ever since we defeated Nazism in the Second World War. What's... The problem with that, of course, is that it simply isn't true. And if we try to understand the actual purposes, the goals, and the mechanisms of American foreign policy, we note that in the last 2 generations, the American executive has killed perhaps 20 million people around the world as a result of these policies that are supposedly supporting freedom and democracy. Now, these vast crimes cannot continue. They're the reason the U.S. is hated around the world. But we have to understand that they're being done not for the peace and prosperity of Americans, but for the profits of the 1%. And until Americans begin to see that, we're not going to get very far. What our rulers are worried about is that Americans are not idiots. They do begin to see that. People do understand that. The wars that John Kennedy began in Southeast Asia within a decade, and a decade is not a long time in its consideration, a lot of dead people, but not a long time. Within a decade, 80% of Americans were opposed to them. Now, that gave a real problem to the American rulers who wanted to continue them. They haven't neutralized that problem. And by the way, if you'd like to see a reflection on that problem from the point of view of those who take the line of the American rulership, read Barack Obama's audition piece for the presidency, The Audacity of Hope.
Well, I thought it was mendacity, Carl.
Yeah, I have to stop myself and not correct my error in giving that title all the time. The actual title is The Audacity of Hope, and in fact, it is an exercise in mendacity, in lying. And one of the things he lies about is the nature of the opposition to the Vietnam War, the politics of the 60s, and what should be done about it. But if you want to see the sort of establishment attitude, the attitude that Barack Obama rode into the presidency, look for it there. That's what his masters wanted him to say.
I read the wrong book. I read Dreams of My Father, which was much more positive and hopeful. I didn't read it. But I've been told if I'd read The Audacity of Hope, I would have figured it out.
You know, two of the biggest lies about the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, I should say, the Vietnam War, was one big lie was all those college kids that are protesting the war are just a bunch of spoiled rich kids that are bored. Well, the fact of the matter is most of those kids on college campuses during the 60s and 70s were from working class families.
Yes, that's very true.
And they were the ones in the anti-war movement because they had family members as well as kids, other friends of theirs from high school and in the neighborhood that have either been killed in Vietnam or had come back, maimed and disfigured for life. The other big lie was that the U.S. soldiers coming back from Vietnam were yelled at and spit on at airports.
That's a lie.
That's an absolute lie as well, because a big section besides college campuses where the anti-war movement occurred was in the U.S. military.
Exactly.
And in fact, that's what actually ended the Vietnam War, besides the 80% of the American people that eventually opposed it, was that the military commanders couldn't trust their own troops on the ground. There were whole units in Vietnam that refused to deploy. And there was many cases of their officers being killed by their own troops. So the ruling class learned their lesson. You know, they wanted to make sure the war, and the other thing, the big lesson they got from it was that to make sure they wouldn't let journalists run around and go wherever they want and take film footage like they did in World War II. And since then, we've seen nothing but controlled images that have been shown to the corporate media and then the American people. What's the term where they embedded journalists, where they're basically led around and shown only what the military wants them to see.
This is extremely good points, David, and it's very much worthwhile because it attacks that American mythology that underlies current wars. The notion I mentioned a moment ago that the campus protests against the Vietnam War were motivated by the draft is another one. It is true that the draft had a good deal to do with ending the Vietnam War because it was precisely the revolt of that draftee army in Vietnam that you're talking about, that the troops who were unreliable were indeed draftees. And what did the American government do? It was obvious. They ended the draft as quickly as possible and went to what is essentially a mercenary army. A mercenary army, we call it a volunteer army. It's a volunteer because people like to eat regularly and they need the job.
Economic draft as opposed to
it's an economic draft rather than a political draft. That now, the fact of the matter was that most of the people who were involved in opposing the draft in American colleges in the 60s were not, in fact, subject to the draft. A system of deferments, the so-called channeling memo of the Selective Service System, meant that if you were comfortable enough to go to college, you were comfortable enough to avoid the draft. There were only a few people who could be caught in that otherwise. There's a larger transition that I think about a good deal these days in the current discussions about Thomas Piketty and the conditions of inequality in the United States. The U.S. is a much more unequal unequal society today than it was in 1960.
Oh,
By unequal, I mean that the differences, the variety, the differences in wealth between the top and bottom of American society is greater, and what's called the Gini index, the index of how property, wealth is distributed in the society, is worse. The index is higher. What that means is that in American colleges in the early 21st century, the inequality is worse. There was a greater degree of equality in those colleges where those working class students were also part of the general milieu and objected to the war that the United States was carrying on, not so much from personal reasons, but for reasons of personal reasons came into it because it was American. It was the American War, but the solidarity of American society produced the opposition to the war that began on the college campuses in many cases, but certainly spread beyond that quite rapidly. It's a much more unequal society today, and that can be played on by the administration and by our rulers, and they're doing a fairly good job of it. You're watching News from Neptune for the 1st of August. We have a great deal on our agenda. Other points that either of you would like to mention?
I'll just mention a couple of things about Asia. I did mention this last week that in spite of the fact that there was a military coup in Thailand within 2 months, they have canceled their railroad project. They do have other projects developed, but they're also, the U.S. has promised delivery of F-16s that they had contracted for in 2010. It's after a military coup, and it is very fascist, not in the same manner that in Kiev, for instance, but yet I'll give you one example. A man from Ubon, that's an upcountry town in Thailand, evidently he made, they call them, it's a law called lese majeste, they call it anti-monarchy statements, but then they apply it to the military, to the government, to the elite. Evidently he made as many as 9 comments that were negative on his Facebook page. And as a result, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now, they cut it in half to only 15 years after he proclaimed himself guilty. In other words, once he said he was guilty, and I've always known this, that in Thailand you always declare yourself guilty. If you claim you're innocent, you're sunk. That's just part of the culture in Southeast Asia. But also in Burma, and they have canceled their rail project. I know they're still having a lot of what they call religious strife, but it is definitely fomented by the military government. They have a monk who's leading it, and I just spoke to my activist friend here just this week, contacted me. He's back in the U.S., and he's totally blacklisted because he won't cooperate with the government. So he makes it very clear that in spite of this veneer or veil of freedom that they have painted over Burma, no, it's not. Nothing has really changed from within. He said it's due to a lot of land grabbing and a lot of corruption and money laundering. So I don't have details, but that's a fact.
Karen, these 2 rail projects, it's interesting, both Burma and Thailand.
Well, that's what I informed him. He didn't know that they had canceled it in Thailand. And I say that because I think that...
Were these Chinese rail projects is what I'm getting at?
Yes.
Okay.
They were both Chinese, with Chinese contracts, and they were both canceled. And right about the same time, and we know that in Burma, they actually said due to Western influences, and that can only be the U.S., using humanitarian or human rights concerns for canceling the rail project. But at the same time, we haven't lifted sanctions. That's the good thing. We haven't lifted sanctions. And the sanctions on Burma are strictly business sanctions. They only apply to doing business, so the U.S. companies cannot go in and do business there. We have
Directly.
The World Bank is there. Has been there. I know people who've gone on contract on behalf of the IMF to do studies. So I mean, the planning is all there. Okay, they're just waiting till it's right. Now, and the fact that the two military governments, Burma and Thailand, are becoming closer. They're developing relationships now. Yeah, that's also in the working, which is rather a new thing. Then I'll also mention Indonesia. We know that they had an election. We know that our man, the U.S. man, military general who was involved in massacres in the 90s, he was educated at our School of the Americas here in Georgia. He's known as the U.S. man. Prabowo Subianto lost, although he's contesting it in the Constitutional Court. The gentleman who won is a former governor. His name is Joko Widodo. And what's interesting is that as a governor, and he had the majority, vote, there's no question, representing the poor. They proclaim always a populist. Well, two of the things that he evidently piloted as the governor, one was education reforms, the other was health care reforms. And I thought to myself, oh boy, here we go. How long is he going to last? Now, they have a rail project in Indonesia that they're supposed to start this year. It's not with a Chinese contract, it's with the Japanese to build it. So I don't know that that's going to ever be an issue. But I am watching Indonesia carefully because I keep thinking, I hope we don't see the same thing happen in Indonesia. And others have speculated this also, as far as what will happen, because they know that Prabowo is going to do something. They're not going to sit back and accept this election results. So my concern is, so are they going to use manipulation in another way, similar to what Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood faced when they were elected into Egypt? Suddenly they were not getting cooperation from the police, they were not getting cooperation from anyone, they were having difficulty making things work, which of course require administrative skills that a lot of leaders, we always say today's rebel is tomorrow's leader, but sometimes they don't.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, well, yeah, but sometimes they don't possess the skills. In other words, the best rebel may not necessarily possess the skills as an administrator that are necessary. But then you also have to look at the kind of dirty tricks that can be done to make sure that they fail or that they lose. So I'm hoping we don't see anything happen like that in Indonesia. But I think since Indonesia is the largest Muslim nation in the world, and they are very, very wealthy, with resources, especially oil, very wealthy. In fact, when we were fighting in Vietnam, one of the concerns of our government was, well, if we lose Vietnam and the domino theory kicks in, we don't dare lose Indonesia, no matter what. And that's why in '65 we were supporting this, let's kill off any political activists, kill off communists, and so we ended up killing almost 1 million people. I say we because we were supporting them, and we are still supporting their military. When we support these kind of activities, then we are responsible. And as an American national, I feel it is my responsibility to criticize my government. So.
And I also would like to point out that one of the mantras that emerged from the 1960s and the discovery of American foreign policy on the part of American college students and others, one of the mantras that emerged was the observation, quote, everything is connected. Now, there's a certain jejune quality to that, you know.
Yes.
I mean, to discover that for the first time. But the point here, it seems to me, is illustrated by the fact that American politics in the Mideast backing Israel's massacre is not separate from American politics in East Asia.
Right.
They are serving the same purposes, the same needs, the needs of the American 1%. the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, the war in Southeast Europe in the Kosovo War in the 1990s, and the wars in Southwest Asia in the current decade have this in common. They were all wars that were meant to ensure American economic control, American economic hegemony around the world. And the enemies in each case were those who, for whatever reason, rejected the kind and helpful American approach. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 31st week of 2014, a hand-washing edition. There's a lot of blood on American hands. Yeah. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and David Johnson. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Dan. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.
Just to remind UPTV viewers that tomorrow, Saturday, August 2nd, tune in to the World Labor Hour at 90.1 FM or at www.wft.org to hear an interview with an activist on the ground from Detroit, where there's been a lot of activity going on, water shutoffs and other such things.